Welcome to the Torah of Rabbi Immanuel Bernstein.
Good evening, all. We are 1 week away from Purim, and the topic of the shir is Inyana Diyoma, actually. And before we begin the shir, something which is literally Inyana Diyoma, there will be no shir next week because it will be Monday evening, which is Purim almost everywhere. And therefore, as much as Purim is a time of Kabbalah Satorah, there will be no shir installment from next week, and we'll pick up again in Mitzvah Hashem in 2 weeks' time. But in the meanwhile, to begin our discussion this evening with a matter of halacha and minhag that relates to Purim, and that is the brachos that surround the reading of the Megillah. As we know, before we read the Megillah, we make the 3 brachos, Al Mikra Megillah, She'asa Nisim, She'echianu, and then after the Megillah, we have the bracha of Haravas Rivenu. And let us take a look at them one by one and see certain comments and observations and insights that we find in the poskim and in the mefarshim. So with regards to the first of the brachas that we make, and this is actually the very first thing we hear out loud relating to Purim in Shul, is the bracha of the Megillah, aside from the Gabbai pleading with the children not to make too much noise before the whole thing begins. But the first mitzvah part is the bracha Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah. And this, of course, is appropriate for mitzvos. Mitzvahs certainly ben adam lamakom. As a rule, we have brachos before them. The simple question, where we say Hashem commanded us to read the Megillah, v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah, where there was no direct command to do that, the Gemara discusses this matter not with reference to Purim, but with reference to Chanukah, but the idea is the same. In the second parak of Shabbos and Daf Kaf Gimel, V'heichan sivanu, where did Hashem command us to light Chanukah lights, which we also say? To which the Gemara answers, Lo Sosur, where the Torah in Parsha Shoftim says not to swerve or deviate from the words of the Sanhedrin. That incorporates following what the Sanhedrin, what the Chachamim say, or including their takonos, including the mitzvahs of Chanukah, and also Purim. And interestingly, the Rambam in Hilchos Brachos, when he discusses this idea that Asher Kedushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu refers to the Torah telling us to heed the words of the Chachamim, he doesn't quote the words lo sasur. He actually quotes different words in the pasuk where it says va'asisa kechol asher yarucha, which is the asay part of that pasuk. There's an asay to follow the Sanhedrin, lo saseh, not to swerve from their words. And as Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Kesef Mishnah points out, what the Rambam is denoting is that the source can certainly not be from the words lo sasor themselves. Lo sasor is a lo saseh. We never make a bracha on a mitzvah's lo saseh. Even a mitzvah from the Torah, that's a lo saseh. There's only brachas on mitzvah saseh, which means when the Gemara cites the word or uses the reference of lo sasor, it's the lo sasor pasuk, but it means specifically the positive part within it, where it tells us to follow the Chachamim, which is what the part that the Rambam quotes. And therefore, it's a kind of a indirect tzivui. The Torah underwrites the words of the Chachamim. In so doing, it's commanded us to follow what they say, whether it's lighting the menorah or reading the Megillah. In terms of the nusach of the bracha al mikra Megillah, many poskim raise the question, when one compares this with another mitzvah, which is very similar. In Shul, the Baal Kori reads the Megillah and everyone listens. On Rosh Hashanah, the Baal Tokeah blows the shofar and everyone listens. Yet when it comes to Mikra Megillah, the nusach of the bracha is al Mikra Megillah, over the reading. But when it comes to shofar, the bracha is lishmoa kol shofar. So they don't seem to be exactly parallel. We don't focus on what the one person is doing in both of them or what everyone else is doing in both of them, but rather for the Megillah, it's the reading that he does, and for shofar, it's the hearing that everyone else does. And Mefarshim explain that this is because those two mitzvahs, as much as practically they take the same form, one person does something everyone hears, but the two mitzvahs are not the same. When it comes to shofar, as Rambam says explicitly, the mitzvah is to hear the sound of the shofar, which means the Baal Tokea is providing everyone with the means to then fulfill the mitzvah of hearing it. And that's why the nusach of the bracha is about the hearing. That's the mitzvah, lishmoa kol shofar. When it comes to the mitzvah of Megillah, there is no mitzvah to hear the Megillah. The mitzvah is to read the Megillah. Everyone has a mitzvah to read the Megillah. Now, it could be practically that only one person is reading and other people are listening. That's because he is motzi them in their obligation to read the Megillah. It's not that their mitzvah is to hear it. Everyone's mitzvah is to read it. Through hearing, they fulfill the obligation through shomer ka'oneh of reading the Megillah. And that's the mechanism. As we know, a person could be motzi other people in things that they need to say. And interestingly, the case of reading the Megillah specifically brings out a certain understanding of what shomer ka'oneh means, what it means to be motzi someone. We might have thought, and some people suggest, that the way shomer ka'oneh works is that the chiddush is, by listening to someone, it's as if you're actually talking. Your listening is halachically generated speech. The alternative is, no, it's not as if you're talking. It just connects you to the one who is talking. And should we ask, does it make a difference? Yes. On Purim, in Megillah reading, it will make a difference. Because you're only Yotze reading the Megillah if you read from a kosher Megillah. Which means anyone who's listening but not following from within a kosher Megillah, which is most people, if we just understood that shomer ka'oneh is as if they're speaking, it's not enough. Because it would be as if they're reading the Megillah Baal Peh, and they wouldn't be Yotze. So the idea that everyone is Yotze through the Baal Kori means they're literally connected to his mitzvah, and just like he's reading from the Megillah, they're all part of that mitzvah of reading from the Megillah. So there's quite a lot of shomer ka'oneh discussion that revolves around the Megillah, but these are the observations with regards to the first of the three brachas, Mitzivanu al Mikra Megillah. The second bracha, She'asa Nisim, is more or less understood. It's similar to Chanukah, where since the mitzvah is to mark a miracle, we also make the bracha She'asa Nisim. And the third bracha, She'achianu, also one could say is well understood. When one performs a mitzvah that one hasn't performed for such a long time, it's often accompanied with Shechianu. Possibly the day of Purim itself deserves a Shechianu, and therefore our third bracha is Shechianu. Now, the first time we make Shechianu, which is when we read the Megillah at night, is not much cause for comment, because this is the first time since last year that we're reading the Megillah. But the big shaila comes up, what about next morning? Megillah, as we know, is read in the night and in the day. So in the night reading, you haven't read it for a year. In the daytime, you've actually read it just a few hours before. So do we still make the bracha of Shechianu or no? And here we find there is a major discussion amongst the Rishonim as to whether Shechianu should be repeated in the morning. What we could call Ashkenazi Rishonim, the Tosfos and the Rosh, citing Rabbi Tam and others, are of the opinion that even though you make Shechianu at night, you make it again during the day. And the reason why is because the two readings of the night and the day are not the same. If we would compare it, for example, with Kriyat Shema in the evening and the morning, those two readings are exactly the same. It's just different times. But the two readings of the night of Purim and of the day, between the two of them, the daytime reading, says Tosfos, is the Ikar. It's the primary reading. And why is it the primary reading? Tosfos say there's more Pirsumei Nisa during the day. Tosfos do not elaborate as to why there's more Pirsumei Nisa during the day. Maybe there's more people. Maybe there's other things going on which publicize the miracle. But this highlights the daytime reading as primary, so much so that even if you made Shechuyanu last night on the lesser reading, quote unquote, relatively speaking, there's reason enough to make it again for the primary reading, which is a big chiddush. We never normally find this. You've already fulfilled the mitzvah, but now you're fulfilling it more or to a greater degree. It's worth another Shechuyanu. But this is what Tosfos say. There is another way of understanding why you would make Shechuyanu in the day on the Megillah reading, even though you already made Shechuyanu at night. And it's to be found in the Sefer Turei Even, which is a commentary on Maseches Megillah by the Shagas Ari, Rabbi Aryeh Levi Metz. And he says as follows: many, and this is worthwhile knowing about Purim in general, many Mefarshim, beginning with certain Rishonim, understand that the mitzvahs of Purim are not entirely in the category of D'Rabbanan mitzvahs. We normally divide mitzvahs in terms of level between Torah level mitzvahs and rabbinic level mitzvahs. Purim is somewhere in between, and possibly even closer to Torah level mitzvahs. And the reason why is because the mitzvahs of Purim are known as Divrei Kabbalah. And Divrei Kabbalah is the Gemara's way of referring to things that are spoken about in the Navi. And of course, the mitzvahs of Purim are in the Megillah. That places them in this middle category of Divrei Kabbalah, of mitzvahs Nevi'im. And for many Mefarshim and Poskim, this is a cut above a regular, quote unquote, D'Rabbanan mitzvah. Okay, that's important to know. All the mitzvahs that we do, Mishloach Manos and Matanos Levyonim, one is fulfilling a mitzvah of Midivrei Nevi'im. And the Rambam makes a point of introducing them in that way. His introduction of the mitzvahs of Purim is, it's a mitzvah Midivrei Sofrim from D'Rabbanan. V'hadavar yadua shehu mitakanas Nevi'im. It's known that this is an institution of Nevi'im. The Rambam emphasizes that, and some say in order to establish this higher level. Okay, so we've discovered that the mitzvahs of Purim are more than other D'Rabbanan mitzvahs. However, says the Turei Even, that is only true for the mitzvahs of Purim that we do during the day. The days of Purim are Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha, and we know that the mitzvahs of Purim are only for the day. V'hayomim ha'ele nizkarim v'nasim. You don't fulfill the mitzvahs if you do them at night. But then we come to this Megillah reading on Purim night. That is the exception. It's the only one of the Purim mitzvahs that we do at night. And the Turei Even maintains, if we learn the Gemara, we're not going to go into the details now, but if you see how this is derived, the nighttime Megillah reading, it's based on a pasuk, but it's not the same. It's a pasuk in Tehillim, in fact. It's D'Rabbanan. It's not Midivrei Kabbalah. There's a divide between Megillah reading at night and Megillah reading in the day. Everything that happens during the day, including Megillah reading, is Midivrei Nevi'im. But what happens the night before is Midrabanan. So the result is that even, of course, we make Shechuyanu and a D'Rabbanan mitzvah also. You'll make Shechuyanu on Chanukah lights the first time you light. But by the time you come the next morning to read the Megillah, you make Shechuyanu again. Because the mitzvah of reading the Megillah as a mitzvah of the Nevi'im has nothing to do with what was fulfilled the night before. That was a separate mitzvah midrabanan. Of course, ultimately they're connected, but the Shechuyanu of that D'Rabbanan mitzvah doesn't cover your Divrei Nevi'im mitzvahs. And hence, says Turei Even, indeed, one should make the bracha of Shechuyanu again. This is
get my thing on?
The opinion of the Rabbeinu Tam, as we said. However, the Rambam states quite clearly that in the morning, one recites two brachos. There's no Shechianu in the morning. So we have before us a dispute among the Rishonim. Now, halachically, not surprisingly, this will now become the two opinions of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, and the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles. Rabbi Yosef Karo, representing, shall we say, the Sephardi side, paskins like the Rambam, that one doesn't make Shechianu again. And the Ramah says that the minhag is like the more Ashkenazi Rishonim, like the Rosh and others, that one makes Shechianu again. Thus far is the basic trail. However, it is very interesting to note that the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide on this question is not as denominational or monolithic as we might think at all. There are major Rishonim on each side that actually hold what the other side says. Which means if we say that the Rambam representing Minhag Sfarad says not to make Shechianu in the morning, but you have the Rashba, Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet of Barcelona, Spain, and you have the Magid Mishnah, Rabbeinu Vidal of Tolosa, Spain. These are Sephardi Rishonim. I mean, they are from Sfarad. And they both say that the minhag is to make Shechianu again in the morning. And conversely, you have major Ashkenazi Rishonim who say that one doesn't make Shechianu again. The Tur, the Rosh's son, Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim, a pillar of Ashkenazi halacha, says the minhag is not to make Shechianu again. And that is echoed by the Maharil, Rabbi Yaakov Molin, pillar of Minhag Ashkenaz, also says in the morning you only make two brachos. So there's a lot of cross-pollination here, where to say that the Ashkenazi Rishonim say one way and the Sephardi Rishonim another way is not so clear-cut at all. And in fact, even after the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah ruled, it still is not so clear-cut. Because now we say, well, Ashkenazim will also say Shechianu again. The Vilna Gaon, as recorded in the Sefer Maaseh Rav, he's of the opinion that one should not say Shechianu in the morning. The Ramah has already ruled that one does, but the Vilna Gaon held that one shouldn't. From what I know of Minhag Yerushalayim, even though it's based a lot on Minhag Hagra, they do say Shechianu in the morning. Maybe there are stalwart Vilna Gaon people who do everything based on the Gaon who don't say Shechianu. And the converse remains true. There are Sephardi communities who do say Shechianu. The minhag of the Kehillah in Izmir, in Turkey, as recorded by Rabbi Yitzchak Palaji in the Sefer Yafel Alev, and other Kehillahs also, they would say Shechianu. So it's very interesting. I think this might warrant a Shechianu by itself. In other words, as machlokases go, it's a very achtusi machlokas. There's a lot of sympathy for both positions, but of course, halacha lamaisa, each kehillah follows its minhag, and that's with regards to Shechianu. But interestingly, and this should be is recommended, the Mishnah Berurah phrases it as nachon. It's correct to do the following, and that is in the morning, just before you make the Shechianu, people should be informed to have in mind that the Shechianu is not just for the morning reading, but for all the mitzvahs of the day. And indeed, as we said, perhaps even for the day itself. These are mitzvahs that one now can perform. And the converse question now comes up. What if a person doesn't have a Megillah during the day? Can he say Shechianu anyway, perhaps before doing one of those other mitzvahs? There are actually poskim who say that he can, although hopefully we shouldn't get to that situation. And if you are in that situation, ask a shaila and also get hold of a Megillah. So these are some comments with regards to the first three brachos before reading the Megillah. Al Mikra Megillah, Shas Nisim, and Shechianu. And then after the Megillah reading, we have the bracha of Harav Esrivenu, which interestingly, the Mishnah says is a matter of minhag. If your minhag is to say it, you say it. And nowadays it is the widespread minhag. to say it. Everyone makes this bracha of Haraves Rivenu. But a very interesting question, which is easy not to ask when people are actually saying Haraves Rivenu, the Balkore, is what type of bracha is this? What one may ask very balabatishly. I've made a bracha on the Megillah beforehand. What is this bracha that I'm making after the Megillah? Now, one could say very simply that we do find there are certain things that you make a bracha before and after. Hallel has a bracha beforehand, Likros HaHallel, but then also ends with a bracha. Psukkah de Zimra begins with a bracha, Baruch Omer, and ends with a bracha, Yishtabach. So we are familiar. And Hallel, I think, is a good example of mitzvahs where you make a bracha beforehand and afterwards. However, the question is as follows. If indeed the bracha after the Megillah is the after bracha for the Megillah, why does it start with Baruch? Why does it start with the words Baruch Atah Hashem? Generally, when you have before and after brachas, so the after bracha is connected to the one before, and therefore it doesn't start with its own Baruch. For example, Yishtabach. The after bracha of Psukkah de Zimra starts Yishtabach Shimcha Ad Malkeinu. It ends with Baruch, but it doesn't start with Baruch. And the after bracha for Hallel also doesn't start with Baruch. It starts Yehalelucha. That's the beginning of the bracha. It ends with Baruch, Melech Melav Shbachos, but it doesn't start with Baruch. And neither does Emes V'Yatziv, or Emes V'Emunah, which are the after brachas of Shema. So if indeed Haraves Rivenu is the after bracha for the mitzvah of reading the Megillah, Rishonim want to know, why does it start with Baruch? It should start Haraves Rivenu or however it should start. And it's for this reason that there is a school of thought among Rishonim, represented by the Ran and others, who say that Haraves Rivenu is not an after bracha for the Megillah. It's not a bracha over the mitzvah of reading the Megillah. Rather, at this juncture, having read the Megillah, it is a special bracha of praise to Hashem for further elaboration on having performed the miracle, etc. But it doesn't have the relationship of bracha to mitzvah. It's not a bracha on the mitzvah of the Megillah, which is very interesting. Or one could say slightly differently, it is a bracha after the Megillah, but it's not the after bracha of the Megillah. It was just positioned at this stage. And indeed, this will help us explain something else. The widespread minhag is that the bracha of Haraves Rivenu is only said when the Megillah is read b'tzibur, not if it's read privately. Now consider any other mitzvah that you would do privately. If there's a bracha before and after, say the bracha before and after. If a person is saying Hallel on Yom Tov by themselves, they make a bracha before and after. It doesn't make a difference that the bracha doesn't go away just because they're not b'tzibur. However, says the Aruch HaShulchan, once we understand that Haraves Rivenu is not a bracha on the Megillah, but it's a bracha for Pirsumei Nisa purposes, to further publicize the miracle, that's why it only takes place where there is Pirsumei Nisa, which is where there is a minyan. That's why that bracha is only said there. So this is a very interesting way of looking at Harav Es Rivenu. We shouldn't take for granted if it follows the Megillah, it must be a bracha on the Megillah. And yet, there are other Rishonim who understand that Harav Es Rivenu is indeed a bracha over the Megillah. And should we ask the question, does it make a difference? Tachlis, you're saying it at exactly the same place. Does it make a difference whether it's a bracha on the Megillah? It might. What if the Baal Koreh has finished reading the Megillah and then someone engages him in conversation, and then he's reminded, you didn't say Harav Es Rivenu yet. If Harav Es Rivenu is a bracha on the Megillah, on the mitzvah, he couldn't make that bracha anymore. He's made a hefsek between the mitzvah and the bracha. But if it's a bracha to be made after the Megillah, one shouldn't interrupt. But if he did, he can still make the bracha. It's not a hefsek. It's not connected to the Megillah. It's just stationed afterwards. So there could be halachic implications. And there are those indeed who say that Haravis Rivenu is the after bracha for the mitzvah of reading the Megillah. But of course, the question will come back. Why then does it start with Baruch? It should be like Hallel and just start with Yahalelucha or Haravis or something like that. And there are many answers to this question given by Rishonim, but I came across just today a fascinating answer to this question, which is found in the writings of the Chavos Yoreh, Rabbi Yochanan Bachrach, one of the great poskim of the 1600s. And he has a sefer on the Orach Chaim section of Shulchan Aruch. It's called Makor Chaim. And he says as follows. For me, it was a revelation. We find in the Gemara and in the Halacha that Megillas Esther is exceptional among the Nevi'im and Ksuvim. It has many halachas in common with a Sefer Torah. The way that it's stitched has to be like a Sefer Torah. The way that the lines are underlined, what's called sirtut, right? Which is traced underneath or etched somewhat. You don't need it in Nevi'im and Ksuvim. You need it in Torah and you need it in Megillas Esther. There is something about Megillas Esther, and perhaps this brings us back to the idea that Megillas Esther, the Purim story, is a time of Kabbalah Satorah. And therefore, because it, in a sense, reclaims, in the full meaning of the word Kabbalah Satorah, Megillas Esther itself has a lot of commonality with a Sefer Torah. Says the Chavos Yoreh, in the same way that the Megillah has a lot in common with the Sefer Torah, the reading of the Megillah has a lot in common with the reading of a Sefer Torah. And that's why you make a bracha before and after, just like you do when you read from a Sefer Torah. And that, says the Chavos Yoreh, is why the after bracha starts with Baruch, because that's what happens when you read from a Sefer Torah. The beginning of the bracha is Asher Baruch Harbanu. And then the after bracha starts with Baruch again. Asher Nasan Lanu Toras Emes. That is actually for other reasons. Initially, the bracha before laning and the bracha after laning weren't made by the same person. It was the Kohen, or the first one to be called, who would make the bracha before, and then everyone would just read. And then the final one to read would make the bracha afterwards. There were only 2 brachas in total. But as time moved on, they instituted that each person should make the bracha before and after, but because initially they were made by 2 separate people, the second one will start with Baruch from the beginning. That stayed, and because it stayed when we read from the Torah, it also is transferred to the reading of the Megillah. Reading of the Megillah is like Kriyas HaTorah. You start with Baruch and you end with Baruch. And moreover, says the Chavos Yoreh, it's for this very reason that Haravis Rivenu is only said when you read the Megillah B'tzibur. Because isn't the same thing true if a person reads Torah? Everyone who comes to read the Torah will make a bracha beforehand. But when do you make a bracha after reading the Torah? Only when it's B'tzibur. And therefore the same is true here. Wherever you are, you'll make the bracha al mikra Megillah beforehand. When it comes to afterwards, the after bracha for the Megillah is like the after bracha for laning, and that is only when it is B'tzibur. So these are some very, I believe, interesting and illuminating insights into the brachos. We normally focus on the Megillah. The brachos are accessories, which of course they are, but they certainly deserve their own such fundamental questions to be raised about the nusach of the brachos, and Shechiyanu, when do we say it, and Haravis Rivenu, what is it, and when do we say it, and why? So these are some of the highlights from the poskim and the mefarshim. So having discussed a matter of halacha and minhag, let's move a little towards thematic material with regards to Purim itself. We know that Purim represents the second in the series of 4 exiles that the Jewish people will experience. The first is the exile of Babylon, which is Nebuchadnezzar when he destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, and then we were exiled to Bavel. During those 70 years, we shifted into a second exile because Persia took control from Bavel. So now they are now in charge of everything, including the Golos. And that's the second Golos, and it's during that time, as we know, that the Purim story happened. The third Golos is Yavan, the Golos of Greece, around Chanukah time, which took place in the land of Israel. And the third is Golos Romi, which is basically spread to everywhere from the second Beis Hamikdash, destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, and onwards. There is a fascinating comment of the Alshich HaKadosh in his Perush to Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim, which we had just 2 weeks ago, as we know, deals with Nezikin and damages. And as the Mishnah famously tells us, there are 4 major categories of damage. Arba, Avos, Nezikin. They tell the story of the Talmud learner who wanted to make sure that he got the most out of every word, and he never got past the first 2 words of Baba Kama because it says Arba Avos, and he knows that there's only 3 of us, and he just got stuck there until further notice. Sometimes you have to read a little bit further, and it's really Arba Avos Nezikin. And what are the 4 primary categories of Nezikin? They are Shor, an ox, represents animal. Bor, a pit, if a person digs a pit and someone falls in. Hamav'eh, which the Gemara explains means a person who personally damages directly. And Hahev'er, Hav'ara, which is fire. So once again, they are an animal, a pit, the person himself, and damage through fire. And the Alshich HaKadosh explains that the 4 exiles of the Jewish people parallel these Arba'a Avos Nezikin. Which means for our purposes, the second of the exiles, Persia, which is where the Purim story happened, parallels the second of the Avos Nezikin, which is Bor, which is a pit. And the question is, what does Bor have to do with the Purim story? But the Alshich elaborates further. There are, in the broadest sense, four sins that the Jewish people will need to atone for and expiate in order to reach the final Geula. They are the Chet HaEgel, and we'll take them in the order of the exiles. They are the Chet HaEgel, which of course was a world-changing sin for the Jewish people, the golden calf. The second is Mechiras Yosef. The sale of Yosef also represented at a seminal time, at a formative time. The third is the more prior sin of Adam HaRishon himself, which changed everything in the world, and that also needs to be rectified. And finally, the sin of the Meraglim, of the spies in Parshas Shelach, the report they spread about the land of Israel. So once again, to review those 4 as he arranges them and presents them, you have the Chet HaEgel, it's number 1, the sale of Yosef, number 2, Chet Adam HaRishon, number 3, and the Meraglim, the spies, number 4. He arranges them in that order because that's the order of each exile. Meaning, if we go back to the first of the exiles, which is Bavel, and Bavel now corresponds to the first of the Nezikin, which is the ox, the shore, because that is as a result of the Chet HaEgel. We know that the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed primarily because of Avodah Zarah, which was really all an emanation of the original Chet HaEgel. And the Egel is often called the shore. I mean, it's the son of the ox, and in Tehillim it's referred to as a shore. So the shore is the first exile of Bavel. The bor, the pit. And what's the pit got to do with Persia? Because the pit is associated with the sin of the sale of Yosef. Because that's where they put him. And that's where he was drawn out of, just before he was sold. So bor has the association and connection with Mechiras Yosef. And as we will see, that is a dominant theme, a dominating theme within the Purim story. Obviously, we'll come back to that. Just to see numbers 3 and 4, Mav'eh, the third of the Nezikin, if we're keeping track, is a person himself. Adam Hamazik, and that corresponds to Chet Adam, Harisha, which was all about a person, whether he should follow his own ideas or God's ideas, in terms of whether eating from the tree of knowledge is good for him. Is it yes, good for him, not good for him? Maybe he has a better way for himself. And that really paves the way for a philosophy that will detach a person from Hashem and he can understand everything by himself. Eitz Hadas, and that's Yavam. That's the story of Greece. And finally, Hever, which is conflagration, which is fire. That's the sin of the Meraglim, which led to both Tisha B'Avs and significantly the second one, both destroyed in fire, which led us into exile that we are today. So this is a fascinating way of seeing how these really 3 fours line up. The 4 Avos Nezikin, the 4 primary sins, the 4 Golios, and for our purposes, Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela, having introduced and set up, we come back, of course, to number 2, which we have seen is the bor, is the pit. And that's the pit of Yosef. And that corresponds to the exile of Paras. And why? Well, the answer is not hard to intuit. And it relates to a discussion that we began last week, whereby Haman knows that the reason why the Jewish people are vulnerable is because they are chronically beset by a state that is called mefuzar u'meforad bein ha'amim. They're distant from each other, they're apart from each other, and we need to appreciate that when there is fragmentation and disparity and discord among the Jewish people, it's not a new enterprise. It's considered to be a continuation of the terrible legacy and a reopening, really, a flare-up of the original fragmentation, which was the sale of Yosef. That's why the Meshech Chochmah famously says that when we say on Yom Kippur that Hashem is Salchan li Yisrael, Umachalan li Shivtei Yeshurun, we're talking about the ongoing kapara that we need for the 2 averos of the Egel and the sale of Yosef. That's why the Egel was done by Yisrael, Eile Elohecha Yisrael, and the sale of Yosef that was done by Shivtei Yeshurun, by the Shvatim. The sale of Yosef keeps on going until we shut it down. But it flared up at the time of the story of Yosef, the story of Purim, and that's why, in a sense, the story of Purim is a rehash of the sale of Yosef and how to get out of it. And as we say, the tikkun began, Lech Kenosis Kol HaYehudim. Jews need to start caring about each other. They need to start to have the interests of other Jews at heart as well. And we should know further. Last week, we mentioned that, or in our discussion of Haman's offer to pay Aseres Alafim Kikar Kesef. He's going to buy out the Jewish people with 10,000 talents of silver. Aseres Alafim Kikar Kesef. In the event, Achashverosh tells him to keep the money, but that was his offer. And as we cited the Gemara, Hashem proceeded with the Machzis HaShekel, but which represents the unity of the Jewish people. But how do these 10,000 Kikar Kesef, how do they capitalize on the lack of unity amongst the Jewish people? Rabbeinu Bachya, in his Perush to Parshas Kisisa, which is next week, we won't have a shir, but at least something from the beginning of next week. And he explains that this payment is in order to activate the accusation of the sin of the sale of Yosef. What do 10,000 talents of silver have to do with the sale of Yosef? Says Rabbeinu Bachya as follows. Yosef was sold for a price that is referred to in the Pasuk as Esrim Kesef, 20 pieces of silver. Now, 20 what of silver? The Yerushalmi says that it's 20 zuz of silver. There's 4 zuz in a shekel. Shekel of the Torah, that is to say. Shekel HaKodesh. Which means, if Yosef is sold for 20 zuz, that means he's sold for 5 shekel HaKodesh. Indeed, it's for this reason, says the Yerushalmi, that when a person comes to redeem his firstborn child, he pays a value of 5 shekalim. That's where it comes from the sale of Yosef. You might think that the child is worth more, but as Meshech Chochmah explains what the Yerushalmi means to say, if you were prepared to sell Yosef for 5 shekels, that's all you can expect if you want to be redeemed from you. So 5 shekalim represents the amount that was received at the time of the sale of Yosef. The core number of Jews, we always say, is 600,000, the Shishim Ribo. Now, cautiously, and making sure we don't get lost along the way, but it's just another 1 or 2 steps. If there's 600,000 Jews, 5 shekels for all of them will equal 3 million shekels. What is a kikar? It's translated into English as a talent, which doesn't really help us much. Specifically, a kikar, says Rashi, is 300 shekels. That is what a kikar of kesef is. Well, if a kikar is 300 shekels, then 10,000 kikars are 3 million shekels, which is 5 shekels for each Jew. The 5 shekels that the brothers received for Yosef, Haman says, I will cover the entire nation, paying 5 shekels for each, because they deserve the same fate that Yosef had when they sold him for 5 shekels. That's where the Aseres Alafim Kikar Kesef comes from, in order to activate the indictment over the sale of Yosef. And interestingly, there's a phrase in the end of the 3rd parak, which we looked into last week, which assumes now entirely new significance. It's the final words of the parak, where the decree goes out to exterminate the Jewish people. And then what does the pasuk say? What is that? What does Achashverosh and Haman do? They sit down to drink. Does it make a difference what Haman and Achashverosh did after that? The point is the decree. There is a medrash, a collection of medrash on Tehillim. It's called Medrash Shocher Tov. And in Perek Yud, it says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shvatim, Hashem says to the tribes, Atem machartem achechem mitoch ma'achal u'mishteh. You sold your brother and then you sat down to eat and drink. That is a reference in Parshas Vayeshev, as we know, as the pasuk describes. They sold the Yosef to the Yishmaelim for 20 kesef, which we just said is 20 zuz, 5 shkalim. Veishvulecha lechem. They sat down to eat. And that was considered to be, if one can say, insult to injury. In other words, this terrible trauma has just happened, and they sit down in a somewhat detached or callous manner, and they sit down to eat. No one's lost their appetite, even as they did what they felt needed to be done. Says the Medrash, Hari benechem nimkarim b'Shushan, your descendants will be sold into slavery or worse in Shushan. Mitoch achila ushtia, shenemar v'hamelech v'haman yashvu lishtos. And what we see here is, once again, if there's been a flare-up of the period between brothers, as began by the sale of Yosef, so then the full punishment is not just to be sold, but Haman and Achashverosh still sit down. They sit down to drink. As if nothing out of the ordinary happened. And of course, as we say, the way out of it, refuah lamaka, the way out of it is for the Jewish people to do something which sounds on paper much easier than it ends up being. And that is to unify. And moreover, the Radal, Rabbi David Luria, in his Perush to Esther Rabbah, explains Once we understand how the Jewish people had kind of gotten themselves back into a Mechiras Yosef state at the time of the Purim decree, who's going to lead them out of it? Mordechai. And why? Because he is Ish Yemini. He's from Binyamin. Binyamin is the only one of the tribes that was not involved in the sale of Yosef. You need someone from Binyamin to kind of lead you out of it. And what's very interesting is that Mordechai actually is both from Yehuda and from Binyamin. That's why he's introduced as Ish Yehudi and Ish Yemini. So it's very interesting, even within the person himself, so to speak, could the Ish Yemini side help with the Ish Yehudi side? But either way, you need that message to get out of it. And so we do. And not only did the Jewish people unite at that time, and as we said, Sorer HaYehudim, Haman gathered the Jewish people together, but this continues to be a theme on every Purim. Through what? Well, last week, as we said from the Manos Halevi, it's through Mishloach Manos. You send gifts. Everyone likes to receive Mishloach Manos. Whether they're going to eat them or not is another question. But the idea itself, in Reb Shlomo Levi Alkabetz's words, laharbos achva v'reus, to increase feelings of togetherness, it does. It's amazing. But this will give us new insight into another of the mitzvahs of Purim, Mishteh, the feast. The feast of Purim ultimately is a tikkun of the feast or the meal that the brothers had when they sold Yosef. Because when they sold Yosef, they'd gotten rid of one of their number, and then they sat down to eat. And that was considered to be so incorrect, it even became part of their punishment as Hamelach v'Haman yashvu lishtos. So how do you get out of it? Sit down again to eat and drink, and don't leave anyone out. The Suda of Purim, the Mishteh of Purim, in the end, is a tikkun for what went wrong, and it's enshrined and embedded in the mitzvahs of Purim. Halavai should stay for the days, weeks, and months that follow. It shouldn't be a once-a-year thing. A once-a-year reminder shouldn't be forgotten the day after the reminder. And this idea of Achdus, as we say, which is, again, we talk about it, it's easier said than done, but we need to talk about it. If it's not said, it will for sure never be done. It also pervades, I believe, another aspect of the halachas of Purim. Purim has a very unusual feature to it. And that is, from the outset, it is instituted for different people on different days. And I don't think there's anything like that. In other words, in the Chutz La'aretz, if you keep 2 days Yom Tov, that's how it happened, and whatever. And everyone keeps 2 days in the Chutz La'aretz, but you understand it should be the one day. Here, from the outset, ab initio, if you're in this type of city, you're on the 14th. If you're in this type of city, on the 15th. Mara'u al-kacha. We can borrow some words from the Megillah. What is behind this? And there's many answers, but I feel that part of it is as follows. Very often, what's called sinas chinam, this mysterious entity called sinas chinam that somehow is all over the place, it can start in a l'shem shamayim way. That is to say, everyone wants to do the right thing. We naturally assume that the right thing is the way that we do it. Which means if someone does something different, it might not be wrong, but we already view it with suspicion. We look askance at that practice. It has a point again to just because it's different than how we do. And this is something which was recognized from the very beginning. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, in Parshas Vayechi, when he discusses the brachos of Yaakov, notes that every brother gets his bracha, but they're all together as each brother gets a bracha. Which, when you think about it, the extent to which every bracha, every brother, his bracha is personal to him. So why does anyone else need to be there? Yaakov could call them in bichidus and first speak to Reuven, then to speak Shimon, or maybe Shimon and Levi together. They share a bracha, but generally speaking, Asher has his bracha, Naphtali has his. But no, they're not called in privately. Everyone is there the whole time. Why? So Rabbi Yaakov says it's for this reason. The brachas are different. He's doing this, and he's doing this, and he's with the ships, and he's with the learning Torah, and he's with he's the melech, and so on. Whatever else it will be. And as important as it is for each brother to know that he has his own individual way, it is equally important for him to hear the blessings of all the other brothers. He needs to hear from Yaakov that there are 11 brothers who are not like him, and they all have the blessing of Yaakov. And the Medrash says that Yaakov was warning them against machlokas, and this is part of how he did it. He didn't just say avoid machlokas. This is part of how it is. Sometimes things are actually wrong, but something has to be wrong before we condemn it, as opposed to just being different from us. Where do we see this? I believe it's embedded in the halachas of Purim, where from the outset, some people read and have Purim on the 14th of Adar, others on the 15th of Adar, and they're best of friends. I don't think anyone ever looked down on anyone else who kept Purim on a day different than him, which is a miracle. I don't think people who do day 14 and day 15, they keep to themselves. I don't think any mother ever told her children that, if you could, we love all Jews, but if you could find some nice day 14 children to play with, I think that would be better. Nothing of the sort. And how does it work? Because everyone understands that they have their mitzvah, we have ours. In the end, we're both doing the same mitzvah, a different day, and so be it. So on the 14th, if you're in an unwalled city, you say Afreilich Purim, and if you're in a walled city, you say good morning, and vice versa for the 15th. And they visit each other, and they're happy with each other. Says the halacha, that's how you do it. As long as something has the sanction of halacha, even if it's not exactly like you, it's okay. And it's very interesting that after we make the bracha, we're coming back to our brachas of after the Megillah, we say Harab Sirvenu, and then we have that piyut called Asher Heini, which follows the Aleph base, and the final, starting with Shin, is Shoshana Yaakov. And Shoshana Yaakov refers to the Jewish people. Says Reb Chaim Friedlander, why are the Jewish people called a rose? He said it's very interesting. If you look at a rose, the part of the beauty of the rose, and certainly it doesn't disturb the rose, is that not all the petals are the same, and they're not even all facing this exactly the same direction. They could be angled slightly differently from each other, but they're all centered. As long as they're gathered around that center, as different as they could be from each other, together they make the rose. And that's why it's called Shoshanas Yaakov, because it was Yaakov who introduced this rose idea. It's Yaakov who spoke to 12 of his children, their petals around the rose. And they're different from each other, but they're all centered around the same goal. That's Shoshanas Yaakov. That's how it's done. And the final word with regards to togetherness of the Jewish people, because sometimes it doesn't always look so great what the other person's doing, and maybe there are problems. Maybe there are problems. The very last words of the Megillah are about Mordechai. And the last words are V'doresh shalom l'chol, Doresh shalom l'chol, which we translate, I believe, as he seeks out peace for his whole nation. And perhaps that's teaching us that sometimes peace needs to be pursued. You need to seek it out. If you take an easy option, maybe it'll just lead to discord and fragmentation. But maybe it's worth pursuing. Maybe it's worth seeking it out, to be Doresh Shalom. And I might say a little more on the word Doresh Shalom, and this itself is maybe Al Derech Hadrash. But when you darshan a pasuk, so you have what seems to be on the surface, and darshaning goes a little deeper, beneath the surface. Sometimes you need to do that with people. in order to see the positive in them. What's on the surface doesn't always represent the best in them. But don't we often say, but deep down that person he's okay. He might not have the best way of showing it, or etc. Might be a bit brash, might be a bit discourteous, might whatever. But if you can get past that exterior and seek out that which is inside, you're darshaning the person. It's just like people darshan psukim. Derei shalom l'chol. If you darshan the Jewish people, they're fine. I sometimes feel on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we say towards the end of Musaf, Hayom ta'amseinu, Hayom tevarchenu, we say Hayom tidreshenu l'tova. We're kind of asking Hashem to do the same thing. We don't always appear our best, but we ask Hashem, but if you darshan us, if you look what's inside, we're okay inside. We'd like the outside to reflect the inside as best. We're on the way. But in the meanwhile, Hayom tidreshenu l'tova. But why should Hashem dorish us for tova if we're dorish each other l'tova? And that's how the Megillah ends. V'dover shalom, dorish tov l'amo, dorish shalom l'chol zaro, to be dorish tov l'amo. And we'll just conclude by referring back to the bracha of Haravas Rivenu, which we say after the Megillah, and it has a number of phrases in it. And Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Beis Yosef discusses these different phrases. And I believe he could literally be discussing this year, not just this year, recent years, but certainly including this year. Haravas Rivenu, Hashem takes up the dispute of the Jewish people, V'adonas dinenu, and judges their judgment. Says Rabbi Yosef Karo, why these two different things? If he takes up their cause and judges their judgment, so Rabbi Yosef Karo says because people oppose the Jewish people in different ways. Some people oppose them just because they're Jewish and they don't really feel they need to explain anything. There's nothing to explain. It's a natural thing. They don't like the Jewish people and without for any elaboration or explanation. So they have a riv with the Jewish people. And we say that in the end, Hashem is Ravas Rivenu. Those who will say Jews aren't welcome or whatever, and it's not because they care about anything else that's going on. They don't know what's going on, and they don't care about anything else that's going on. So manishtana hakos hazeh mikol hakoses got nothing to do with their humanity. It's because here's Jews, and it's a good opportunity. That's called riv, and Hashem is Ravas Rivenu in the end. There are others who their antagonism towards the Jewish people is based on complaints and arguments, on din. The Jewish people are accused of this or that or whatever it is. And not that it makes much more sense than the people that don't bother accusing them in the first place. But there we say Hashem is Donis Dinenu. For those who just oppress us just because, that's Ravas Rivenu. And for those who would seek to accuse us of everything, even though they barely know what the words mean in actual context, so that's Donis Dinenu. And the Nokemisnik Masenu, whether it's Nifra mikol tsarenu, those who actually do us harm, and also Mishalen Gemul Lacholei Nafshenu. There are many who are opposed to the Jewish people on a nefesh level. They might not be oppressing them practically, but they're quite happy with the downfall of the Jewish people. They will be cheering or jeering either loudly or inwardly as the Jewish people are beset with difficulty. For all of these, we saw this happen during the Purim story, and Hashem came through for the people. But as we say, Purim is as much looking forwards as it is looking backwards. We tap in back to what happened in Purim because we're looking to get that energy for our situation. We need HaKadosh Baruch Hu also for us. La rivas rivenu, la dunes tinenu, linkomis dikvasenu, from all our tsarenu, ovei nafshenu, and never more than in these days mamash. If we say bayamim ahim bazman hazeh, we hope that the modern day miracle of Purim should rival no less than the original one, and that just as we say, everyone should have a freilich Purim, and we should all be blessed with Besuras Tovos, Yeshuas, the Nechamas, Laklal, the Prat. All the best.